In this talk, I'll focus on Deleuze's critique of Hegel and try to suggest a Hegelian response to it. The text in which Deleuze develops his critique most fully is Difference and Repetition, and his polemical target is certain passages of the science of logic. In the first part of my talk, I'll outline Deleuze's critique of Hegel as presented in Difference and Repetition. In the second part, I'll try to offer a Hegelian response, drawing on some categories from the science of logic. Finally, I'll suggest what I take to be the gains of this comparison. Before starting, I'd like to make two preliminary remarks. First, as we will see, Deleuze focuses primarily on certain categories from the doctrine of essence, like identity, difference, contradiction, ground. In this talk, I'll concentrate mainly on the category of ground. I'll show in what sense Deleuze's critique of Hegel is directed at the category of ground, and how it's possible, precisely through Hegel's determination of ground in the science of logic, to respond to that critique. Second remark, Deleuze's analysis of the science of logic in Difference and Repetition is not always accurate. For example, he sometimes identifies negation with contradiction. Other times, he doesn't clearly distinguish between identity and ground. Strictly speaking, these categories, so for example, identity and ground, have different structures in Hegel's logic. Deleuze at times seems not to pay attention to this distinction. However, I don't intend here to challenge Deleuze on these points. Rather, my goal is to follow his critique of Hegel, reach his conclusions, and then attempt to build a Hegelian response. All right, so let's move to the first section. The first part of my talk focuses on Deleuze's criticism of Hegel in Difference and Repetition and its connection to the category of ground. First of all, in Deleuze's reading, grounding is tied to what he calls representation. Representation, in general, is that form of thought which subordinates difference to identity. Representation, and this is number 1 on your handout, signifies this conceptual form of identical which subordinates differences. However, in Hegel, grounding takes the form of a particular kind of representation which Deleuze calls infinite. What is infinite representation? It's a form of representation that seems to recognize the rights of difference. This recognition is only apparent, however, because it simultaneously implies the convergence towards the ground, or the correlation of the grounded and the ground. In Difference and Repetition, this correlation of grounded and ground is precisely the subordination of difference to identity. So, even though Hegel's philosophy seems to grant difference a central role, it ultimately betrays difference because of the grounding operation. To understand this better, we should introduce another important concept in Deleuze's analysis, which is contradiction. Its role is crucial for two reasons. First, for Deleuze, contradiction is the principal dynamic factor in Hegel's thought. It corresponds both to movement and to Hegel's conception of difference. Second, contradiction is also the device through which Hegel establishes the grounding relation, thereby subordinating difference to identity. As Deleuze writes, and this is number 2 on your handout, contradiction resolves itself, and resolving itself resolves difference by relating it to a ground. Here we have then a sequence of 3 different categories: difference, contradiction, ground. For Deleuze, contradiction is the logical means by which difference is resolved into the ground, where here ground can be understood as equivalent to identity. Now, contradiction resolves difference. What does resolves mean in this context? It means 2 related points. First, reference. Through contradiction, difference is referred to the ground. Second, subordination. Through contradiction, difference is subordinated to the ground. In other words, this is not just a relationship between difference and ground, but this is subordination, where ground or identity is the superior term. To support this reading, Deleuze turns to several passages on the determinations of reflection in the doctrine of essence. Here, Hegel first presents the structure of identity, and then shows how identity implies and is connected to difference. He then develops the implicit elements of this structure, showing how the truth of difference can be conceived first as diversity, then as opposition, and finally as contradiction. At the end of this process, contradiction resolves itself into what Hegel calls ground. So this is the framework Deleuze has in mind. Now, the question is, given that this is Deleuze's reading, why does he criticize Hegel? The mere idea that difference is subordinated to ground is not in itself a philosophical problem. So why does it constitute a problem, according to Deleuze? In Difference and Repetition, there are several passages that touch on this issue, but there is no single or explicit argument. In defending Deleuze's position, my view is this. Deleuze detects a circularity in Hegel's logic, and it's precisely because of this circularity that he considers grounding, that is, the subordination of difference to identity, to be arbitrary. Let me explain this point. So Deleuze focuses on the transition from difference to contradiction. So under number 3 on your handout, you'll find a series of passages that support this reading. I won't read all of them, but just the first one. Difference, he writes, becomes opposition and then contradiction, and this is the quote, when it has been forced into a previously established identity, when it has been placed on the slope of the identical, which makes it reflect or desire identity, and necessarily takes it where identity wants it to go, namely into the negative. So here is the core of the argument. First, for difference to be referred to a ground, it must be first become contradiction. Second, this very passage from difference to contradiction already presupposes identity or ground. This means this process is circular. The operation of grounding subordinates difference to identity, but the very process that demonstrates this subordination assumes identity from the start. In other words, identity, which should be reached at the end as the outcome of the process from difference through contradiction, is already assumed in the very first transition from difference to contradiction. That's why Deleuze calls Hegel's dialectic a false movement. Identity is implicitly assumed at the outset, and so the dialectic ends up rediscovering at the conclusion what it had assumed at the beginning. Instead of unfolding its truth in the subsequent categories, difference, once it has become contradiction, is betrayed and distorted. For this reason, despite the apparent revaluation of difference, Hegel's ultimate aim remains to reduce it to a presupposed identity. His philosophy, therefore, still belongs to the framework of representation. More broadly, Deleuze's claim is that Hegel radicalizes the representational model present throughout much of the history of philosophy. Hegel leaves no space for what Deleuze calls the original, intensive depth, which is the first affirmation of difference. For Deleuze, ground is the device by which Hegel subordinates the immediacy proper to the differential level to unity or identity. And this is 4 on your handout. The ground of sufficient reason is nothing but a means of allowing the identical to rule over infinity itself. In Hegel, difference can only be domesticated on the basis of a presupposed identity, an identity introduced in an arbitrary way. That's why Deleuze rejects this model and instead affirms the primacy of difference, according to which identity are produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of difference and repetition. So to sum up the content of this first part, for Deleuze, Hegel is a foundationalist who subordinates difference to identity through what he calls the operation of the ground. By contrast, Deleuze develops a non-foundationalist metaphysics in which things and entities are nothing but the outcomes of differential processes. All right, so now I'll move to the second section of my talk. Here, I want to examine Hegel's account of ground and consider whether it leads to the foundationalist conclusions described by Deleuze. The leading question is this: does Hegel's concept of ground involve a foundationalist move? A move in which difference is grounded in and subordinated to identity or anything similar to that? To answer this question, I look at the three categories that Hegel develops under what he calls determinate ground: formal ground, real ground, and complete ground. I'll also make a brief reference to the category that follows, namely the condition. Since this part of logic is quite complex, I'll try to make it easier by using one example taken directly from Hegel's text and another one of my own. As the time available is limited, I'll be brief and synthetic, and I apologize for that, but if you would like to go back over some details, I would be happy to do so in the discussion. So, the first form of determinate ground is formal ground. Here, ground and grounded share the same content. Formal ground corresponds to an identity between ground and grounded, and this is 5 on your handout. There is nothing in the ground that is not in the grounded, and there is nothing in the grounded that is not in the ground. At this stage, we are basically dealing with just one content, which can be considered once as ground and another as grounded. So let's consider an example used by Hegel. We're looking for the reason, and in this sense we're looking for the ground, of the movement of the planets around the sun. Well, physics tells us that the reason or the ground for this movement is the attractive force on the Earth and Sun on one another. According to Hegel, this is a formal ground because there is no difference between the content of ground, attractive force, and that of the grounded, the movement of the planets. It's indeed the same content, just observed in two different ways, once as grounded, once as ground. With the next determination, real ground, we have the emergence of difference. The transition to real ground occurs by making explicit a feature implicit in formal ground. We have seen that the content is the identity of ground with grounded and grounded with ground. From here, Hegel makes explicit the difference between the two, and this is 6 on your handout. Each ground and grounded, each is, in its determinateness, this identity of the whole. The ground is identical with the grounded in its determinacy, that is, as ground and not grounded. Conversely, the grounded is identical with the ground in its determinacy, that is, as grounded and not ground. From this follows the emergence of an essential difference between ground and grounded, which now have a different content. Once this difference, implicit in formal ground, is made explicit, we obtain real ground. For this reason, according to Hegel, real ground implies two logical moments. A moment of identity between ground and grounded, since the first is still the essential determination of the second. A moment of difference, since the grounded has some determinations that aren't reducible to the ground, to the essential moment. So let me give you an example. Suppose we meet a person we consider to be very friendly. We might say that friendliness is an essential trait of this person. In other words, it's the ground of this person. But of course, this person is not exhausted in being friendly. Sometimes she's angry or sad or simply indifferent in ways that cannot be explained by friendliness alone. So although friendliness captures an important trait, it abstracts from many other characteristics that also belong to this person. This, for Hegel, is a real ground. Friendliness is the ground, a moment that is both identical with and different from the grounded, in this case, the person. This difference corresponds to a series of determinations that the ground doesn't account for, but which are nevertheless present in what we call grounded. Now, Hegel's point is that this difference leads to a problem. His idea is that the difference at play here implies an external link, and this is 7 on your handout. Ground, in determining itself as real, consequently breaks up on account of the diversity of content which constitutes its reality into external determinations. In other words, real ground by itself is not sufficient to provide as a ground. It presupposes something else. It presupposes another ground in order to function as a real ground. In our example, friendliness in itself cannot serve as the full ground of this person, since there are other traits external to it. Friendliness, in order to be the essential determination that it is, needs a further element. In Hegel's language, it needs a further ground. And that's what leads Hegel to the next category, the complete ground. The basic idea of complete ground is that the very relation between ground and grounded is itself grounded in another element. Hegel writes, and this is 8 on your handout, the real ground relation is rather the ground as sublated. Consequently, it constitutes rather the side of the grounded. So the real ground itself is now grounded by a further element, which is valid as another ground. So what is this another ground? I think Longness is right here when she points out that it's not the arbitrary introduction of a different reality as the ground of the first or of a mysterious substratum. Rather, complete ground should be understood as a progress in the thought of real ground. It makes explicit what was implicit in real ground and what's necessary for it to be the real ground that it is. The progress consists in the understanding that the foundational instance is itself grounded and made possible by a relation, the relation between the essential and the inessential. Going back to our example, friendliness can still be considered as an essential trait or ground of this person, but it works as such only on the presupposition of the unity of the entire person as the connection between essential and inessential determinations. This connection presupposed by the ground is what Hegel calls the absolute relation, whose primary feature is immediacy, as it's not mediated by anything else. So, what we have here is that ground itself presupposes another element in order to work as ground. Furthermore, we also know that this element presupposed by ground is immediate. Bringing these two ideas together, we arrive at the thought that ground presupposes immediacy, or in other words, that ground is conditioned by immediacy, and that this immediacy is the condition of ground. In the next section of the logic, Hegel turns it into what he calls condition. I cannot go into details here, but the basic idea of this paragraph is this. Hegel highlights the reciprocal presupposition of ground and condition until they both become mere moments of a single, unified movement. He calls this movement die Sache an sich selbst. And it leads to the following topic of the logic, which is the emergence of the thing into existence. However, what I find most interesting for this talk are some of the expressions Hegel uses to qualify this movement, and this refers to 9 on your handout. At one point, he speaks of a groundless absolute becoming. In another passage, he writes, ground, therefore, does not remain behind as something distinct from the grounded, but the truth of grounding is that in it ground is united with itself, so that its reflection into another is its reflection into itself. Consequently, the fact, die Sache, is the groundless. Okay, what does this mean? Many things, of course, but most importantly for our topic, it means that Hegel's last word on ground is not that it's a kind of super reality or some metaphysical substratum that justifies things by existing apart from them, but on the contrary, we could describe Hegel's concept of ground as an outward movement that realizes itself only in the emergence of what he calls grounded, namely the thing, die Sache. So going back to the leading question of this section, does Hegel's concept of ground involve a foundationalist move in which difference is grounded in and subordinated to identity or anything similar to that? Well, my answer is negative. There is nothing like that in the determinate ground. Hegel's ground is not a kind of ultimate reality supporting the realm of life and difference, as Deleuze suggests. The formal ground is a tautological reduplication in which ground and grounded are identical. In the real ground, there is no intrinsic link between ground and grounded. Complete ground, in turn, leads to the idea that ground is not a self-sufficient element in itself. Rather, it shows its relativity to a series of conditions, and also that the truth of grounding is the movement of the emergence of the Sache, where this movement can be defined as groundless. That's why I don't think that Hegel's concept of ground leads to foundationalist outcomes. So to conclude, I'd like to briefly point out what I consider as the gains of this comparison with Deleuze. First of all, I want to stress that the refusal of a transcendent ground is not what separates Hegel from Deleuze, but rather what most deeply connects them. Of course, this doesn't mean ignoring the differences between them. And yet, if my reading is correct, both philosophers disclose a non-foundationalist model. According to this model, the thing doesn't find its principle in some other or separate foundation. Rather, the thing emerges through a dynamic process, a process of differentiation in Deleuze, or the process of the emergence of the thing into existence in Hegel, which, once again, it describes as a groundless absolute becoming. If this marks an important point of proximity between Hegel and Deleuze, their divergence on the very same issue is equally significant. I think that Deleuze's critique of the idea of ground ultimately relies on a presupposition that is not fully justified, namely the primacy of difference over identity. By contrast, if we turn to Hegel's logic, foundationalism is not criticized by assuming external principles. Rather, it's the very logic of ground itself that shows, by virtue of its own structure, a reversal into its opposite. In this sense, Hegel offers an immanent critique of foundationalism. It doesn't reject foundationalism on the basis of the primacy of difference over identity, but rather because the very logic of ground, through its own development, leads to non-foundationalism, to the groundlessness of the thing. Precisely because it doesn't depend on an ultimately arbitrary presupposition, I think Hegel's version of non-foundationalism is to be preferred to that of Deleuze. And since the theme of this conference is Hegel and his critics, I find it particularly important to highlight how Hegel is able to offer a powerful alternative in dialogue with one of the most influential contemporary philosophers. Thank you very much for your patience.